My name is Lavinia, and I am a 25-year-old passionate veterinary technician. For my entire life, I genuinely believed that I was part of a completely normal and loving family. However, my adoptive mother Lorraine was a highly manipulative narcissist who was completely obsessed with absolute control and maintaining a perfect public image. She constantly told all our neighbors that adopting me was the hardest and most selfless decision of her entire life. But the absolute truth was deliberately hidden deep beneath our house. One quiet Saturday, Lorraine aggressively ordered me to completely clear out our dusty basement to make room for my cousin who was moving back to town. She did not even bother to ask me nicely, but simply left a cold, sticky note demanding that the space be completely spotless. So there I was, completely covered in thick dust, violently dragging heavy cardboard boxes across the freezing cold concrete floor. Most of the items were just old holiday decorations and fishing gear belonging to my passive adoptive father, Glenn. But as I was aggressively moving things around, I made a highly devastating and life-altering discovery. Tucked deeply and deliberately behind an old water heater, I found a heavy box tightly sealed with packing tape. Lorraine's name was written right across the top in faded marker. I carefully opened the sealed box and found a faded manila folder sitting quietly inside. When I opened that folder, my entire reality violently shattered into pieces. Inside the folder, I found an official adoption certificate and an original birth certificate that I had absolutely never seen before. Typed right in the center of the heavy paper was the name Baby Girl Dunar. But the absolute most soul-crushing betrayal was completely hidden underneath those official documents. I pulled out an official tax consultant's receipt that had a single specific line heavily highlighted in bright yellow ink. I stared at the paper in absolute paralyzed horror as I read the words adoption tax credit for exactly $5,400. I sat entirely alone on that freezing concrete basement floor for almost an hour, completely unable to cry. Instead, my brain desperately began recalculating every single childhood memory I ever had. I thought about every single time Lorraine loudly reminded me how incredibly lucky I was to be taken in by her. I thought about the fake holiday cards she sent to our neighbors, proudly calling me her greatest blessing just to feed her massive ego. Sitting in the dark dust, I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that my adoptive parents' supposed boundless love was a complete lie. Their incredible generosity was actually nothing more than a highly calculated and incredibly greedy financial transaction designed solely to exploit a helpless child for massive government tax write-offs. Instead of storming upstairs and immediately confronting my highly toxic adoptive parents in a massive fit of rage, I decided to play an incredibly brilliant and strategic game. I completely refused to let Lorraine frantically manipulate her way out of this massive and highly calculated betrayal. Desperate to uncover the absolute truth, I remembered an unused online DNA ancestry kit that was sitting completely forgotten inside my bathroom drawer. I secretly swabbed the inside of my cheek, tightly sealed the small envelope, and quietly dropped it into the public mailbox late that exact same night. For exactly 6 exhausting weeks, I successfully maintained a perfectly normal face. I completely hid my absolute disgust, while Lorraine actively continued to treat me like a pathetic financial burden inside her house. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting entirely alone, I received a massive digital notification that completely changed my entire destiny. The bright screen of my phone explicitly displayed a 99.7% parental match with a woman named Helen Dunar. My hands were violently shaking, but I bravely typed out a highly careful email simply stating my name and quietly asking if she was my biological mother. Within just a few short hours, Helen sent a highly emotional reply, explicitly stating that she had been desperately waiting for that exact message for 25 entire years. Over the next 8 long months, I successfully lived a highly secretive and beautifully calculated double life. Every time I had a day off from the veterinary clinic, I quietly drove 2.5 hours away to a small town to finally meet my real biological family. I discovered the heartbreaking truth that Helen was only a highly vulnerable 22-year-old girl when her own toxic family aggressively forced her to give me up entirely against her will. But unlike the coldness of Lorraine, I was immediately and warmly embraced by Helen, her incredibly supportive husband Tom, and my loud and deeply loving biological brother Cody. They genuinely loved me exactly for who I was, completely without demanding any hidden financial motives or toxic gratitude. Helen tearfully showed me the tiny faded hospital wristband she had secretly kept for 25 years. explicitly revealing that she lit a candle for me on every single birthday. While Lorraine actively continued to fake her perfect public image and heavily weaponized my basic human needs, I was quietly building a beautiful and ironclad support system. I sat at my real family's kitchen table, absorbing their massive, unconditional love and finally understanding what a genuine home actually feels like. Surrounded by the absolute strength of Helen, Tom, and Cody, I was meticulously preparing myself for the ultimate public confrontation that would soon completely destroy Lorraine's fake reality. As I continued to quietly build my beautiful new reality, with my real biological family in Ridgemont, the situation back at my toxic adoptive house was rapidly and violently deteriorating. As I closely approached my 25th birthday, Lorraine's highly toxic and deeply controlling behavior violently escalated to an entirely new level. She desperately wanted to move her niece Brittany into my small converted garage apartment because Brittany had just gone through a breakup and needed a cheap place to crash. But instead of sitting down and having a normal, loving conversation with me like any real mother would, Lorraine chose maximum cruelty. She maliciously slipped a cold-typed piece of paper right onto my kitchen table. I came home from a long, exhausting day of working with sick animals at the veterinary clinic and found the stark white document lying silently waiting for me. When I read it, I found a highly aggressive and completely unaffordable rent increase. The vicious letter explicitly stated that my monthly rent was being violently hiked from exactly $400 to an impossible $850 effective immediately. She knew perfectly well that I could not afford that massive price gouging on my highly modest veterinary technician salary, especially when factoring in my expensive health insurance and my massive student loans. The formal typed letter coldly concluded with an absolute and terrifying threat, explicitly stating that if I could not pay the new massive amount, I had exactly 30 days to entirely vacate the premises. Hoping for just a single ounce of basic parental support, I walked directly across the yard into the main house to question my passive adoptive father, Glenn. I found him standing quietly in the kitchen, slowly pouring a cup of coffee. When I desperately asked him how they could possibly do this to me and where I was supposed to go, he completely refused to even look at my face. He cowardly stared straight down at his dark coffee cup entirely, refusing to defend me, and simply muttered that Lorraine had her reasons and that Brittany needed a place to stay. He just kept stirring his coffee in absolute silence, completely abandoning me. That was the exact moment I fully understood the massive depth of Lorraine's highly manipulative game. She was deliberately weaponizing my most basic human needs. She actively used the terrifying threat of sudden homelessness and the crushing fear of losing my health insurance as her absolute ultimate leverage just to keep me completely obedient. She desperately needed me to feel entirely trapped, powerless, and fully dependent on her highly toxic charity. But Lorraine was incredibly arrogant and made one massive, fatal miscalculation in her cruel game. She had absolutely no idea that I already completely knew the devastating truth about the massive adoption tax write-offs hidden deeply in the basement. She also had absolutely no idea that I was already deeply connected to a powerful and loving biological family who would absolutely never let me fall into homelessness. This incredibly cruel eviction attempt was absolutely not the crushing emotional blow she arrogantly intended it to be. Instead, it was the exact perfect catalyst that I desperately needed to finally stop waiting and proudly execute my brilliant master plan to permanently destroy her fake public image, once and for all. Exactly 4 days before my highly anticipated 25th birthday, Lorraine suddenly knocked on my apartment door, wearing something I had not seen in years. She had perfectly painted on her fake, incredibly sweet performance smile. This was the exact same highly manufactured smile she usually reserved only for church potlucks and impressing our wealthy neighbors. She aggressively insisted that she and Glenn wanted to take me out for a special birthday dinner on Friday night. She explicitly stated we were going to Maggie's place, which is the absolute busiest and most popular restaurant in our entire small town. Then she slightly tilted her head and coldly mentioned that we had something highly important to discuss. I instantly saw right through her massive manipulative trap. Lorraine deliberately chose a highly crowded and very public venue on a busy Friday night for one specific reason. She was absolutely terrified of losing her ultimate control over me. She fully expected to drop a massive and devastating emotional bomb on me right in the middle of dinner. She ruthlessly planned to force me to sign the cruel eviction paperwork entirely, believing that I would be far too embarrassed to scream, cry, or cause a massive public scene in front of the entire town. She heavily relied on my lifelong obedience to keep me completely quiet, while she permanently destroyed my life and neatly handed my apartment over to her niece. I knew exactly how she operated. She thought that by surrounding me with completely innocent bystanders and highly respected community members, she could easily trap me into perfect submission. She arrogantly assumed I would just swallow my tears and blindly obey her cruel commands just to avoid massive public humiliation. But she was incredibly wrong about my breaking point. I was completely done being her pathetic, submissive victim. The exact second I watched her walk back across the yard and heard her screen door shut, I immediately picked up my phone. I frantically called my real biological mother, Helen, and explicitly told her that the ultimate confrontation was finally happening on Friday night at Maggie's place. I firmly asked her to come to the exact same restaurant, but I told her to secretly book a completely separate table and wait for my physical signal before stepping in. Without a single moment of hesitation, Helen promised that they would absolutely be there. Her voice was incredibly steady and fiercely protective, as she explicitly told me that Tom was already grabbing his car keys. They promised to secretly drive 2.5 hours down to my town and sit entirely ready to protect me when the massive family drama finally exploded. For the next 4 days, I meticulously packed my heavy purse with the undeniable proof. I carefully placed the official DNA results, the heartbreaking handwritten letter from Helen, and our beautiful family photograph right inside my bag. I was absolutely no longer a terrified hostage waiting to be casually thrown away. I was a highly prepared woman walking directly into a manipulative trap, entirely ready to permanently destroy Lorraine's perfect public image once and for all. On Friday night, Maggie's place was completely packed with local residents. The restaurant was filled with the loud chatter of our small town, because Friday night dinner was a highly sacred tradition. Sitting just 2 tables away to our right was the highly respected town pastor Jim Hadley and his wife. Lorraine confidently arrived and slid into the booth across from me, wearing an expensive red dress that she normally saved for special events. She was sipping her glass of wine and looking around the crowded room, acting exactly like she was the absolute queen of the entire town. My adoptive father, Glenn, sat quietly next to her, staring entirely down at his plate like a completely defeated coward, entirely refusing to make eye contact with me. After a few incredibly tense minutes of highly fake small talk, Lorraine finally folded her hands tightly on the table. Without a single ounce of genuine empathy in her voice, she coldly dropped the massive emotional bombshell. She looked right at me with a practiced expression and explicitly told me that I was adopted. I did not scream or cry. I simply sat perfectly still, because I had already lived through the absolute horror of this massive discovery on the freezing basement floor exactly 8 months ago. But Lorraine arrogantly misread my absolute ironclad silence as complete shock, and she decided to keep pushing her highly toxic agenda. In a moment of pure, unfiltered cruelty, Lorraine arrogantly confessed the exact horrifying truth I had already discovered hidden inside that sealed box. She looked right into my eyes and explicitly stated that they only kept me because the massive tax deductions and financial credits helped them survive some extremely rough financial years. Hearing her proudly say those incredibly toxic words in a crowded public restaurant made my blood run completely cold. She explicitly admitted to my face that my entire childhood was absolutely nothing more than a highly calculated business arrangement. Lorraine then paused and gave me a deeply condescending closed-mouth smirk. She ruthlessly declared that since I was now 25 years old, the lucrative government tax benefits had officially expired, and they had completely done their part as parents. She actually believed she was an incredibly generous savior. Before I could even begin to process the massive audacity of her cruel words, she aggressively reached into her expensive purse. She pulled out the brutal typed 30-day eviction notice and violently slid the harsh paperwork directly across the table. She then aggressively pulled out a pen and slammed it down right next to the paper. With an absolutely cold and commanding tone, she explicitly demanded that I sign the eviction paperwork immediately to completely vacate their property. She fully expected me to break down in pathetic tears and obediently sign my life away right there in front of the pastor and the entire town. But she had absolutely no idea that my real family was secretly watching her every single move. Lorraine fully and arrogantly expected me to completely break down right there in the middle of the crowded restaurant. She desperately wanted me to cry pathetic tears, apologize for being a financial burden, and obediently sign the harsh eviction papers just to keep the peace. She heavily relied on my deep fear of causing a massive public scene to force my compliance, but I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not shed a single tear and my hands did not shake. Instead, I looked away from the cruel eviction notice and stared directly into Lorraine's eyes. I held her gaze for 5 full seconds with a terrifying and ironclad composure that completely unsettled the older woman. I kept my voice incredibly quiet and calmly asked her if that was all she had to say. When I firmly refused to pick up the pen and sign the paperwork, Lorraine completely lost her temper. The fake performative smile entirely dropped from her face and her absolute need for total control violently took over. Desperate to aggressively reclaim her absolute power over me, she leaned across the table and viciously attacked my biological mother. She completely forgot that we were sitting in a packed restaurant with the highly respected town pastor sitting just 2 tables away. She loudly hissed that my real mother was just some careless girl who threw me away like yesterday's trash. She aggressively claimed that I owed her my entire life because absolutely nobody else ever wanted me. Hearing her publicly call my real mother trash was the exact moment I flawlessly executed my ultimate counterattack. I felt absolutely no shame, only a massive wave of pure clarity. I calmly reached into my heavy purse and pulled out the plain white envelope I had been carrying for weeks. I looked directly at the toxic woman who had financially exploited my entire childhood, and I violently shattered her entire manufactured reality. First, I pulled out the official DNA ancestry report and laid it flat on the table directly next to her untouched pen. The bright text explicitly displayed a 99.7% parental match. Then I reached back into the envelope and pulled out a beautiful, beaming photograph of myself standing arm in arm with Helen, Tom, and Cody. We were all squinting in the bright sun and smiling genuine smiles that you absolutely cannot fake. I slid the photograph right next to her expensive glass of wine. I kept my voice incredibly level and explicitly told her that it was actually very funny she brought up my real mother. I looked right at her pale face and calmly announced that I had actually found my real family exactly 8 months ago, and that they had been desperately waiting for me for 25 years. Lorraine was completely paralyzed. Her face froze in absolute horror. Her mouth opened but absolutely no sound came out, leaving the highly manipulative woman entirely speechless as her massive web of lies completely collapsed in front of the entire town. As Lorraine stared in absolute paralyzed horror at the photograph of my happy biological family, her face instantly turned the color of pale paper. She was completely frozen, like a computer screen that had entirely crashed, but had not completely turned off yet. But I was absolutely not finished destroying her highly toxic and massive ego. I looked directly at the manipulative woman who had financially exploited my entire childhood for 25 years, and I delivered the absolute ultimate jaw-dropping plot twist. I calmly leaned forward over the table and explicitly announced that my real family was absolutely not just a photograph. I kept my voice incredibly level and explicitly told her that they were physically sitting right there in the restaurant. Lorraine's head violently snapped up, and her panicked eyes frantically darted across the crowded room, searching desperately past the wooden booths and past the completely silent Pastor Jim. I turned my head slightly and gave one tiny subtle nod toward the far corner booth near the window. Instantly, my real mother Helen confidently stood up. Then Tom stood up, followed closely by Cody. The 3 of them stepped out from their table and began walking completely across the dead, silent dining room. They did not rush, and they absolutely did not make a frantic scene. They simply walked with the undeniable confidence of a family who had been desperately looking for me for 25 entire years. The entire restaurant completely stopped functioning. The loud conversations instantly thinned out and then completely died. The loud clinking of heavy silverware went completely still, and even the country music playing softly through the ceiling speakers seemed to completely fade away into absolutely nothing. Maggie, the restaurant owner, completely stopped pouring coffee and just stood completely frozen behind the cash register to watch the massive family drama violently unfold. Pastor Jim turned completely around in his wooden chair with his white napkin still securely tucked into his collar. Helen calmly stopped right beside my chair and placed a fiercely protective and deeply loving hand directly on my shoulder. Her touch was incredibly warm and perfectly steady. It was the absolute, undeniable touch of a real mother who had been actively rehearsing this exact beautiful gesture for 2.5 decades. Tom stopped right behind Helen, standing like a massive protective shield while Cody confidently flanked her other side. Seeing my real family standing powerfully behind me, Lorraine violently jumped up in absolute terror. Her sudden movement violently bumped the wooden table, sending her expensive red wine aggressively sloshing over the glass and completely soaking the harsh eviction paperwork she had desperately wanted me to sign. Lorraine was absolutely terrified as she finally realized she had completely and permanently lost her ultimate control over the girl she arrogantly thought she owned. The social consequences for Lorraine's horrific and highly manipulative behavior were instantaneous and utterly devastating. As the spilled red wine dripped completely off the table, Lorraine frantically tried to scream and violently play the victim. She wildly pointed her shaking finger at my biological family and aggressively shouted that she raised me for 25 years. She loudly accused Helen of trying to humiliate her in front of the entire town. But Helen completely shut her down with absolute class. Without raising her voice even a single fraction, Helen firmly stated that she was absolutely not there to cause any trouble. She kept her completely steady gaze on Lorraine and calmly announced that she was only there to physically support her real daughter. The entire crowded restaurant was completely dead silent, and every single person had heard every cruel word Lorraine had said. They heard the massive confession about keeping me strictly for the lucrative tax benefits, and they clearly heard her violently call my real mother yesterday trash. Karen, from the local post office, who had listened to Lorraine's fake, selfless mother stories for years, sat completely shocked with her hand over her mouth. The massive public humiliation of being exposed in front of the entire town was simply too much for my passive, adoptive father, Glenn. In a completely shocking display, he finally reached his absolute breaking point. He did not say a single word to his highly toxic wife. He just stood up aggressively, grabbed his heavy jacket from the back of his chair, and walked right out the front door of the restaurant, completely abandoning her in the middle of the crowded room. Watching her husband walk away without her, Lorraine, entirely panicked. Desperate to frantically save her completely shattered public image, a deeply humiliated Lorraine aggressively turned to the town pastor sitting just 2 tables away. She aggressively begged Pastor Jim to publicly defend her character, loudly pleading with him to tell the entire restaurant what an incredibly generous Christian mother she had always been. But the highly respected pastor absolutely refused to validate her massive web of lies. Pastor Jim looked directly at her with profound disappointment and gently but firmly refused to take her toxic side. He calmly told her that she needed to have a very serious conversation with God, completely exposing her massive hypocrisy in front of everyone. Hearing the absolute rejection from the most respected man in town, Lorraine's face completely crumpled. She finally realized that her perfect manufactured reality was permanently destroyed by her own toxic actions. She was violently forced to aggressively grab her expensive purse and absolutely humiliate herself by running right out of the front door of the restaurant, leaving her completely soaked eviction paperwork completely unsigned on the wet table. After watching Lorraine absolutely humiliate herself and aggressively run out of the crowded restaurant, I went back to my small converted garage apartment for the very last time. I absolutely refused to spend another single minute being a pathetic hostage in Lorraine's highly toxic and manipulative game. The very next morning, I woke up early and ruthlessly executed my final ironclad exit. I did not go to the main house to beg for pathetic apologies. I did not argue with anyone, and I completely ignored the manipulative 30-day eviction notice she had aggressively tried to force on me. Instead, I immediately started packing my belongings. Within just a few short hours, I successfully packed my entire 25 years of existence into exactly 4 small cardboard boxes. I carefully packed my clothes, my official veterinary technician certifications, and the beautiful photograph of my real biological family. It was incredibly eye-opening to realize that after spending my entire life under Lorraine's suffocating control, everything that actually mattered to me easily fit right into the small back seat of my car. My fiercely loyal best friend, Claire, drove over to help me load the last remaining boxes entirely without asking any unhelpful questions. Before leaving my apartment, I officially called the health insurance marketplace, entirely removing myself from Lorraine's family plan and permanently cutting her absolute final string of toxic leverage. At exactly 9:30, I walked directly across the yard and stepped right into the main house one last time. The house was completely silent. Lorraine's car was parked in the driveway, but all the heavy curtains were tightly drawn shut. She was hiding entirely inside, completely defeated, and absolutely terrified to face the strong daughter she could no longer desperately control. I entirely bypassed her closed bedroom door and walked straight into the quiet kitchen. I confidently placed my silver apartment keys right on the cold kitchen counter. I placed them directly next to the harsh eviction paperwork that was still completely unsigned and heavily stained with the spilled red wine from the massive restaurant confrontation. I calmly took out a pen, and underneath the blank signature line, I wrote one single, highly aggressive and ironclad message in blue ink. I explicitly wrote the exact words, "You do not need 30 days, I am completely done today." Without a single look back, I confidently walked out the front door, jumped into my car, and aggressively drove away from that toxic property forever. I did not look in my rearview mirror for 3 entire miles, permanently severing all ties with the manipulative people who had actively viewed my entire childhood as absolutely nothing more than a profitable line item on a tax return. Exactly 1 year after I aggressively drove away from that highly toxic property, my entire life had beautifully and profoundly transformed. I was completely thriving in a brand new veterinary job in Ridgemont, and I was happily living in my very own beautiful apartment. For the first time in my entire life, I was fully independent of any toxic leverage. Every single monthly bill was entirely in my own name. On the evening of my 26th birthday, I finally celebrated a genuine and beautifully unscripted milestone, surrounded by the massive, unconditional love of Helen, Tom, and Cody. We sat around a loud and happy dinner table, eating homemade food and laughing together as a real family. They were a family that absolutely never once used my basic human needs to actively manipulate me or aggressively demand my pathetic gratitude. Meanwhile, absolute and devastating karma entirely destroyed Lorraine's highly manufactured life back in my old small town. The massive, public humiliation she suffered at the restaurant completely shattered her perfect, fake image forever. She was humiliatingly voted off her prestigious church committee and quickly became a massive social outcast. The neighbors she used to arrogantly impress completely avoided her in public. To make the absolute justice even sweeter, the cousin she viciously evicted me for ended up hating the toxic environment and moved out just 6 weeks later. That meant the garage apartment Lorraine fought so cruelly to control was left completely empty, collecting dust as a permanent reminder of her massive greed. Looking back at my incredibly exhausting journey from discovering that devastating tax receipt completely hidden in the cold basement to finally reclaiming my own identity, I realized the ultimate, absolute truth. I finally learned that setting firm, ironclad boundaries with highly toxic family members is absolutely never a cruel betrayal. It is an absolute and deeply necessary act of human survival. True love is absolutely never used as financial leverage. If someone actively holds your basic human needs hostage, like housing or health insurance, and aggressively calls it love, they are completely lying to you. That is absolutely not love. That is just highly calculated manipulation. You absolutely deserve to build a beautiful life entirely free from their emotional blackmail. Your true worth is never defined by a tax document or a manipulative parent. If you have ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your own absolute peace from a toxic, manipulative family member, please hit that like button right now. Share this incredibly powerful video with someone who desperately needs to hear this exact message today, and please subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of ultimate justice.